Hey everyone, welcome back to the Landlord Chick podcast. So today's episode is one I didn't think I would actually record ever, to be honest. But this was a listener suggestion. So over on Instagram, Lucas sent me a message and I'll read it to you guys. He says, "You always talk about being a multi-generation real estate investor, but yet you've never actually talked about what the other generations are in real estate investing. As I've gone through networking with other real estate investors, I've realized it's very uncommon for anyone to have more than one generation of experience. In fact, most people I talk to are just starting out and are the first people in their family to do real estate. What sort of insight have you gleaned from your grandparents and your parents and other ancestors that have been investors? Is this anything you'd be willing to share on the podcast?" So, Lucas, yes, I will tell this story now in this episode. It's a very unique story, and I do realize that. But usually I've tended to make this podcast not necessarily about me and my venture through real estate. I more try and tell my story, but in relation to knowledgeable information for everyone to have. I don't necessarily like to sit here and just tell my story or my family story. But since it has now been requested and I am beginning more and more to appreciate the uniqueness in my situation, we're going to delve into what it means to be a multi-generational real estate investor and what I've actually learned from my parents and grandparents and others that have invested in real estate. So stay tuned. Building a real estate portfolio is as much about buying properties as being a de facto entrepreneur. I'm Karina Ufinger. I'm a multi-property investor, rental management company CEO, and also a landlord coach. I'm going to show you the systems and knowledge you need to thrive as a real estate entrepreneur. From your first property purchase to building a portfolio of passive income where you work less than 5 hours a week, you'll learn the essential information and skills to build a profitable portfolio and live the life you truly want. Whether you are well on your journey or just starting out, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Landlord Chick podcast. So before we get started, I just want to mention this format's going to be a little bit different. Normally when I record a podcast, it's just one big long segment. I don't really pause recordings into individual segments. But in this instance, to keep track of my storytelling and also to be able to keep track in my mind where I'm at, we're going to be having some segments in this podcast. So whereas normally you might not notice it, what you might see on your end is there going to be like a 1 to 2 second pause maybe in places where I'm going to splice in another segment. And again, that's just for me keeping track of it, where I am in my story, and making sure I'm covering all of my bases. Now in this first segment, we're going to talk about my grandparents and their experience in real estate investing. Now, for me, it's myself. So I'm the fourth generation, and then my parents, my grandparents. And if we go up the family tree even more, there is real estate investing, which I will talk about at the end. And that's only because I don't have a lot of information on that. We're going to start with my grandparents, and my grandparents are actually on my father's side, and it is my grandfather, Merritt. Now, I want to drop him into history per se. I want to give you sort of a timeline of where we're talking in the grand scheme of history. So for starters, my grandfather Merritt was born in 1918. And he started real estate investing in the late 1930s. If you've taken a U.S. history course, or you probably have heard about this through numerous things, the 1930s was the Great Depression in the United States. It was before we entered World War II, where we actually were able to kind of had this boom and recover. So when my grandfather starts out real estate investing, it's in the 1930s. It's in the Great Depression. And that's part of what makes his story honestly unique. But there's many other facets that make his story unique. For instance, he got into real estate investing because it was around the time that mortgages really became, I don't want to say prevalent because they really weren't in the 1930s, but they became closer to what we see today. See, mortgages, they haven't always been around for the average Joe. Usually, if you wanted to take out a mortgage for anything, you had to have substantial assets to back it up. Well, in the 1930s, it's really a geeky conversation, so I'm going to bypass all that geekiness. And I'm just going to say the 1930s, basically, things started to change where it made it easier, not easy, but easier for the average Joe to be able to go and get a mortgage for a piece of land, a property. And this was something that my grandfather actually decided to take advantage of. Now, my grandfather was a firefighter by career. So he went up through the ranks. He did not make it to chief, but he went up through the ranks and he was a firefighter his entire life. And what he actually did was he used that firefighter income, he saved some of it, and he was ultimately able to build his real estate portfolio starting out with that firefighter income. Now, what's also really unique about my grandfather's story is that this idea of not just working for somebody else and having more to life was something not as prevalent as we see it is today. I mean, this was before Tony Robbins, long before Robert Kiyosaki. I mean, these people weren't even born then. So I really think it's amazing that my grandfather had, honestly, I guess you would say, sort of the capacity of thinking, to think outside the box and to really decide that, hey, there's something more to life than this. And I'm sure that there's a way to create a better life for me and my family. And that's exactly what he did. So we're going to start out in the 1930s. My grandfather has been working as a firefighter for about 4 years now. He's lived extremely frugally. Up until that point, he is now engaged to be married to my grandmother. And in 1939, they have tied the knot, and they are also getting ready to move in together. Now, my grandfather has recently purchased a single family home that he thought would be the place that he and my grandmother lived in. He had a quad. He lived in his quad in this one single apartment within his quad building. And he realistically thought that he and my grandma were going to live in the single family home. Well, grandma did a little bit of math. And she's like, you know what, Merritt? We can live in that unit in the quad, rent out the single family home that you bought, and we can have more income coming in. And I really got to give props to my grandmother for thinking that way, because especially for women back in that day, it wasn't very common for them to kind of interject themselves and to really put their piece or 2 cents into the family financials very much. So I do give my grandmother respect for that. So she pointed out to my grandfather that, hey, we can rent out that place for $300 more a month than what our mortgage is. We can go and stay over here in the quad, and we can then save up that money. Now, the $300, that's not what it was back in the day. That's adjusted for inflation, everything like that. But I wanted to make it sort of easy for the flow of the story. So they have the quad, they have the single family home, and my grandfather is accumulating this passive income through the quad. They're accumulating the passive income through their Sharon Street single family home. My father comes into the picture as their first child in the early 1940s. They are content, but definitely tight in the 1-bedroom apartment that they were living in the quad. And then my grandmother gets pregnant with my uncle. Well, at this point, they need to kind of shift gears. So grandma says, you know what, now's the time. So they move themselves over to the Sharon Street single family home. They end up flipping their unit in the quad, which actually was the worst unit in the quad, by the way. So they rented out the other 3. They lived in the worst one. Really sort of the original version of house hacking, except my grandfather admitted to me that they really didn't house hack it while they were there. It was sort of like they lived in the worst place, and then they eventually fixed it up after they left, but they really didn't improve it while they were living in there. So fast forward, they're living in the single family home. They've got the quad. And now my grandfather has an opportunity to buy another property. So he goes ahead and he buys a duplex over on Academy Street. And then the time comes a couple years later that, guess what? The Sharon Street home really isn't working out for them anymore. Now, originally the thought process was they were going to rent out Sharon Street again and then just move into their other primary residence. But The timing of the market, the way things were at, because this was post World War II, there was a sort of big economic boom going on in the United States. My grandfather decided, you know what, we're going to go ahead and sell the single family home. We're going to then use that money to go and buy 2 additional rental properties. So my grandfather sells the single family home, which was their first family home per se. They use that money, they go and buy 2 duplexes with that money. And then over the years, it just snowballs and snowballs and snowballs. He was not one to necessarily offload a property at a certain point, because understand, real estate investing for honestly the majority of his career as an investor was not as mathematically scientific as it is nowadays. You really didn't do calculations like internal rate of return and all those sorts of things, because they really didn't have calculators and access to computers like we do today. But my grandfather's strategy was more along the lines of accumulating and then selling when it made sense in the market. It had nothing to do with maximizing the returns at a certain point or anything like that. And he fully admits that it was very unscientific. In fact, when my dad was really big into real estate investing in the 1990s, late 1990s and such, my grandfather was often sort of mystified by the mathematical part of real estate investing that was just starting to kind of become more prevalent. And he always used to shake his head at my dad's spreadsheets and say, if it was this complicated when I was starting, I don't think I would have done it. I'm a simple man. So that's the story of my grandfather. So he started out with a quad, and at his height, and his height actually really happened before I was born, because it was around the late 1980s that my grandfather started to just sell stuff off and then actually enter full retirement. So my grandfather worked for the fire department, by the way, through the early 70s. And then he was actually able to retire what was a little bit early than based on having his income from the rental properties. So that was actually, I don't know if it was part of his ultimate goal, but it certainly worked out that way. Now, my grandfather ended up selling all of his properties. The last one was sold just shortly after I was born. And at his height, he had 35 units. And he did have one larger one. He actually did have a 6-unit, which I did not realize that until just recently. But my father told me that he owned a 6-unit. And that was actually one of the last investments that he bought. But it ended up being the investment that actually was the biggest learning curve for my grandfather, which I'm still kind of piecing together what the learning curve was there. But what I can say that I learned from my grandfather, and the stuff I've learned from my grandfather, I learned after he was a real estate investor. And the conversations we had, the first one was he talked about how when he started out in the 1930s, it was himself, another firefighter couple, and then another friend of my grandfather's. They all decided to collectively start in real estate, but they didn't pool their money together or do partnerships. They all sort of did their own thing in the 1930s, buying their properties and renting them out. Now, what was interesting about this, my grandfather said, by the time 7 years had gone by, both of the other 2 couples had gotten out of real estate investing because they found it too hard to do. And at first, I really didn't understand this. And when I was about 18, 19, I asked my grandfather, I'm like, so the other 2 couples, like, what exactly happened? And this is when he told me the story about how important it is to understand the value of your time and knowing when you need help. See, the other 2 couples that got into real estate investing, they did not go out and hire additional people to help them. So as their portfolio grew, as they went from 1 duplex to two duplexes, they weren't hiring other people to help take care of things. So what this meant is that the couple was in charge of the repairs, the leasing, the tenant relations, the bookkeeping, all of this. And when the husbands had day jobs then, it was very hard to keep up with everything, especially because the wives were at home with the kids. The husbands were at their jobs. Again, considering this is the 1930s, not completely out of the ordinary. They really saw how difficult it was to scale, and they just didn't see how they could possibly scale. Now, my grandfather at that time was already bringing people in to help alleviate his load. So, one of the first things he did was he brought in one or two of his brothers to help take care of the repairs. His brothers were farmers, so sort of entrepreneurs. It was easy for him to call them, ask them to go over to a unit and fix a faucet or go paint a vacant unit. And he really did leverage his circle for being able to scale his portfolio. Because ultimately, my grandfather said the biggest thing that helped me scale wasn't necessarily the fact that I had all of this money that I had accumulated as a firefighter living really cheap. It wasn't the idea of the modern mortgage. What really helped him able to scale was this idea of delegation and the value of his time. He hired his brothers to do the repairs, the turnovers, so that he could go out there. He could be looking at properties. He could be evaluating properties. He could be out there looking for mortgages. He could be doing all these other things that are really the higher tier items in real estate investing. And he left the simpler stuff. Well, maybe not the simpler, but the other things for his brothers. And that was honestly, he said, probably the biggest decision that had the effect on his portfolio was his decision to very early in his career leverage other people's time. Now, the other thing that my grandfather taught me about real estate investing, and this is something I talk about a lot with new investors, is understanding whether you are the type that can self-manage your portfolio. Regardless of whether or not you're going to hire people, bring them in to help alleviate some of the burden on you, you have to understand whether or not you are capable of managing your own properties when it comes to being able to be effective on rent collection, being able to stand your ground, and also being able to not be taken advantage of. So my grandfather said one of the best decisions that he made once his portfolio got to, I think he said once he had the quad, the single family home, the quad, and then the two duplexes. That was when he decided that it was beyond what he could self-manage. It was beyond what his brothers could kind of help with. So he brought in a person that really, as we would sort of call them in modern terminology, a property manager. So this was a person that did the books. They went over, they collected rent. They also then called my grandfather's brothers for repairs. They really were the property manager. And my grandfather always said that there are some people that should never manage their own property. The people that have what we call today a bleeding heart, those that really are affected by people's personal stories, whether they're true or false. You really take in their personal stories and you begin to feel really sorry for them. Those are the types of people that really need to hire a property manager, my grandfather said, because that was one instance of one of the couples. They got really, really taken advantage of by a particular tenant who just had one bleeding heart story after another. And that really, if we looked at that couple who we're going to call the Smiths, their biggest mistake wasn't necessarily in leveraging other people's time. What really was the most costly mistake for them was this tenant who just fed into their helping heart, wanting to help other people. The Smiths were very kind, generous people, but unfortunately they got very heavily taken advantage of by the one tenant. And that's what ultimately undid their interest in real estate as sort of like the final straw. So my grandfather always talked about the necessity for hiring a property manager, especially if you are someone who is a very kind heart, a very generous heart. There's nothing wrong with being a kind and generous person, but you can easily be taken advantage of. And especially in today's era where professional tenants do exist, and they do, believe me, they do. Like, it's not on a resume, but there are people who are so good at being a tenant and skirting laws and taking advantage of particular landlords that you call them professional tenants. So my grandparents were really sort of in the forefront of real estate investing. I give my grandfather so much credit for starting out and for starting this journey when it was looked at as completely crazy. He told me a couple times that when he first told the majority of people, whether it be his brothers or his parents or his cousins, that he was getting into real estate investing, they didn't understand it. They didn't understand, number one, how he could do it, because they weren't really up to date on the new mortgage introduction and rules, things like that. But they also didn't realize why. Why would you do this? Why would you go out and spend your money on these other things? And I think what's interesting about this is that when my grandfather is real estate investing, when he got started, going back to the era of this was the 1930s. This was when people were not even putting money in banks. They were putting it under their mattress, under their pillows, in dresser drawers, because of the financial system collapse and because of how sparse money was. They were hiding it in their homes. There weren't savings accounts. They weren't doing things like that then, at least not in that moment, because of how unstable it was. But yet here's my grandfather during that time says, I'm going to go invest in real estate. I'm going to go use the money that is sitting in a mattress or wherever, and I'm going to go buy property, and I'm going to rent that out to other people. And I really give him credit for starting out then, because not only was it probably really hard to get that first mortgage, especially under those conditions, but to start out in an era with massive unemployment and uncertainty, I think that took a lot of guts. And I absolutely fully respect my grandfather for taking that journey and for making that step. So now we're going to transition over into my parents. So my dad obviously grew up in real estate investing. He hasn't talked too much about growing up in it, actually, which is, I think, a conversation I kind of want to have with him, because I've never actually asked him what it was like to necessarily grow up living with and your father being a real estate investor. Maybe that's because I already know what my experience was. So maybe I kind of erroneously assume that I know what it was like. But I actually don't know too much of the details about my grandfather's real estate investing in relation to how my father was involved as a child or things like that. I do know he's mentioned a couple times that he, during the summer, would maybe go and do some roofing projects for my grandfather, along with his uncle, who was a roofer. So I know there's certain aspects like that, but I don't know for sure how much of a mentorship kind of happened between my grandfather and my father. I do know that my father started out real estate investing in the early 1970s. I don't have a for sure date on that, and I guess that might make me a bad daughter. Maybe, but I don't quite know for sure when they got their first rental property. But I do know that my father did leverage his grandfather's network to get started in real estate investing. So to start out in real estate investing for my parents, what they actually ended up doing was different than what my grandfather did starting out. So for starters, my parents actually formed it wasn't an LLC, because LLCs didn't exist back then. I think it was a corporation. But they formed a corporation with my mother's brother and then also my father's brother. And so there were three couples that collectively formed this company, and that was their holding company for their properties. Now, to get started, their first property purchase was a newly built duplex. It was built by a family friend, so a friend of my grandfather's, who was just starting out in the new construction industry. And part of what he was doing was he was selling the properties that he was building. So he wasn't building them for a particular person. He was building them and then selling them on the open market. So to help get himself started, he was able to sell one of the properties to my parents in their corporation. And this was actually something that continued throughout the years. So this is actually really, really cool, I think. So they bought a duplex from this gentleman. Let's call him Joe. I don't want to say real names here, so let's call him Joe. They bought a duplex from Joe. Joe then goes around and he builds a quad. He goes to my parents and he says, hey, Do you want to buy the quad? If you want the quad, you can sell me back the duplex and I'll take that money as your down payment on the quad. So that's what they did. They sold the duplex back to Joe. Joe used that money as the down payment for the quad, and my parents ended up with a quad. Now, fast forward a little bit, a couple years, my parents are ready for the next property. What they do in that case is they actually take out the equity in the quad and they go and buy another duplex from Joe that he'd recently constructed. Then they continued being repeat customers of Joe for about 3 more property purchases. Then it was the early 1980s. Joe ended up retiring, selling the business to his son. And that was when the relationship between my parents and then Joe's construction company ended. So now my parents are out on their own with their corporation, but they're buying properties off of the open market, just anything out in the city. So my parents actually ended up accumulating about 24 units before the first couple stepped out of their corporation. Now, what's really important to understand about the timing of the stepping out, again, sort of glancing over the geeky part of this, in the 1980s, there was massive tax reform that occurred that really changed the way that passive investors were looked in real estate investing. I don't want to go into too much detail, but suffice it to say that there were a couple things that happened. They drastically changed the scope of what it meant to passively invest in real estate and what your tax liability might be. And also, and this is the part that is absolutely remarkable to me, and this is the only time I've heard of this being done, Congress changed the law, and it wasn't changed for future, it was changed for 3 years prior and future. Now, what this meant was that the couples that were more passively invested in this corporation with my parents, so my aunts and my uncles, they were handed a very large tax bill from Uncle Sam because of the law changes that occurred. It's really hard not to get irritated at this, especially when you consider that they went back on previous year's income tax returns and said, we're changing this and you now owe this. It really is sort of hard for the mind to fathom this, but that's how it went down. That led to the situation where both my aunt and my uncle, who were more passive in this, ended up having to sell their shares and get out of it so that they could actually stop the bleeding that was more or less occurring at this point with their tax situation. So out of this corporation, that one dissolved, and then my parents moved what was left in the portfolio over to another entity. Now, I say what was left because part of the agreement to help pay the taxes that were due for the other partners that were passive was that they would sell some of the properties to help offset some of it. So there were properties that were sold as a result of this reshuffling. After the reshuffling occurred, my parents are in their own corporation. Again, LLCs not existing. Obviously, today, my father would have all of his investments in an LLC because those exist. They are the best form of protection for real estate investing, especially buy and hold. We'll probably talk about that at some point if we honestly haven't already in the podcast. So my parents now are starting out a little bit behind because they did have to sell a little bit. But then my father decided to start leveraging private money. Now, my father started to leverage private money by going to his friends, his colleagues, and he actually got the reputation to the point where he was known as the person to talk to if you wanted to be involved in real estate. And this is something that I honestly still aspire to do. My father was never ashamed of saying what he does for a living, and I'm not ashamed of it, by the way. But usually when I talk about what I do for a living, the first part that comes out is property manager. And this is something that Robert Kiyosaki talks about. It's another book I'm reading right now by Matt Faircloth. They talk about how the first thing out of your mouth when people ask you what you do, it shouldn't be your 9 to 5. It should be real estate investing. Everyone should know that you're a real estate investor. And that's what my grandfather actually did. Was anytime he met people, whether it be at church or through a professional organization or a barbecue, he always introduced himself as a real estate investor first. And before he was retired, a Wisconsin Bell employee second. So the conversation was, oh, well, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a real estate investor. I have, XYZ properties. But then during the day, I actually do work for Wisconsin Bell. A conversation about real estate started. But this is how my father was able to grow a large network for private money lending, was just by talking and communicating with people about how he was involved in real estate. Now, this is where the first lesson that I learned from my father's real estate investing comes into play. So with private money lending, my father openly admits that he made a few mistakes. Number one was he did not fully explain to what we would call outside investors, meaning those that are not involved in real estate. He did not fully explain to outside investors what it means to invest in real estate. My father didn't actually explain to them that it's a long-term investment. This isn't something where you deposit it in with me and you can get it back in 6 months. So my father understands that was a huge failing on his part, that he should have been explaining to these private money lenders that were giving him money that, hey, you're going to park this money with me for X number of years and you won't be able to get it back at all. Like, in order to get it back, huge stuff has to happen. My father did not actually go through the effort of explaining that too well, he said. The other mistake that my father made, and this is one that, being that I've worked in a law office, I honestly have a little bit harder time comprehending, but my father also said that for a lot of the outside investors, again, people not involved in real estate, it was a verbal exchange between them. It was a verbal agreement. There weren't formal written agreements. The only ones that had formal written agreements were the investors who were involved. So people that were active investors that were lending my father money. My father did not go through the process of setting up private money lending agreements with outside investors, friends, family that were putting money in. And this actually did end up being a huge issue, because compounded with this idea of him not necessarily fully explaining what it meant to invest in real estate, he had people coming and asking for their money 6, 8, 10 months later. And without anything to back it up as far as it being a long-term investment, no piece of paper, my father had no choice but to basically switch things around and get the money to pay back that real estate investor who thought they were just doing something short term and they can go get it whenever they wanted it. So for instance, one of them came to him and said, hey, my car broke down. I need that money back so I can go buy a new car. That's not how this works. But my father had nothing to back that up. So he did learn from his mistake there. Unfortunately, he didn't learn really quick enough. So by the time my father really reached the height of his portfolio, he had under his ownership about 85 properties. And slowly, one by one, as his private money lending mistakes caught up with him over the years, he was forced to decrease that portfolio. And it was in the early 2000s that my father and mother, after quite the career in real estate and being of the age to get retirement, they decided, you know what, we are out. So they sold things completely, which was fine, because on top of having some money from the sales of the properties a little bit, they also had my father's military pension. They had my father's retirement from Wisconsin Bell. So really, it all sort of created this situation where my father's like, you know what, I think I'm done. I'm going to sell stuff off. I'm going to pay people off. And I'm just going to kind of lick my wounds and go into retirement. But I made a good life. And he did make a good life. And he really did make a good life, because one of the benefits that I obviously saw with this was that my parents were able to take us on more vacations than most kids got. I got a lot more opportunities than most kids got. They obviously were able to spend more time with us as we were kids growing up. And then as we were young adults, teenagers, and in college and stuff, we certainly had the advantage of having our parents around a lot more than some of our friends did. So my father was really successful in real estate, and I do give him a lot of credit for thinking big because he really did think big. My grandfather kind of set the bar at his 30 some units. Uh, and my father was the one with the big dreams. My father was the one that said, you know what? I want more than that. I want a bigger portfolio than that. And my father really did become a force in real estate investing to the point where there's people that I encounter in my real estate investing career and they find out my maiden name and I tell them, yeah, as in my dad. And they're like, wow, that's crazy. He's your dad. I'm like, yeah, he's my dad. And they're like, wow, he was a really big person in real estate. I'm like, yeah, he was. He definitely was. So I talked about my father, I talked about my grandfather, and those are the ones that I honestly know the most information about. In this last segment, kind of briefly, I want to talk about how it existed up higher in the family tree. And this is going to be rather abstract just because there's not a lot of information on this. So as we wrap up this rather long episode of this podcast, we're going to talk about this first generation of real estate investors in my family. And I want to say I don't have a lot of information on this, mainly because of how far back we're going. So we're going to be talking about my thrice great-grandparents, Benjamin and Caroline. We're going back to the 1860s, 1870s. We're going really far back. Now, what I will say is, if you remember the conversation when we were starting out talking about my grandfather, he was able to get into it because of the changes in mortgage lending in the 30s. Obviously, with my grandparent, with my thrice great-grandparents now, you know that there's likely some generational wealth involved. So both my grandpa Benjamin and my grandma Caroline, they came from very wealthy families that were based in Pennsylvania. They actually moved to Wisconsin before it became shortly after it became a state, when there was sort of this giving away of land in Wisconsin to boost the state population. So they took advantage of it. They came to Wisconsin. They got very large plots of land in southeastern Wisconsin. And one of the things that they ended up doing was they ended up parceling out segments of the farm and renting them out to people. So the first tenants were able to build a home on that piece of land, and they're able to farm the land. And from what I can gather from letters, the setup was there was a flat monthly fee for renting the plot of land. And then on top of it, there was a crop share. Now, I don't know if the crop share was something where you gave them 10% of your wheat, if you gave my grandparents 10% of your wheat, or if it was 10% of your wheat profits. I'm not entirely sure what the structure was there, but there was the flat fee, and then there was the percentage of the crop share, or the harvest, basically. This was something that they did. From what I can tell, there were 5 tenant farmers that were based on their farm, as well as the large plot of land that they farmed themselves. At some point in the 1860s, like the late 1860s, it seems, they even went into town and bought one duplex, and then eventually they bought what was a purpose-built quad. So this was before the era of large home subdividing. There was a quad that was purposefully built. So they ended up purchasing at least a duplex and a quad. Now, what's really cool is I've actually been able to trace the buildings, and the buildings are still there. I had to kind of trace them because street names change, numberings change. So I'm very lucky that the local library in that area of the state has a massive research materials and a research desk that was willing to basically do the legwork for me and figure out what the current addresses are of these properties. So they do still exist. I drive past them, just like my grandfather's buildings. Actually, one of his is like 3 blocks down from one of my properties. So I kind of purposely go a certain route to my rental property just to kind of look at grandpa's and, check up on it and all that stuff. So getting back to my thrice great-grandparents, I don't know a lot about their situation, but from what I do know, they had the tenant farmers, they had the duplex, and then they had the quad. There is some conversations in some of the letters about tenants. So in one in particular, after Grandpa Benjamin had passed on, he actually did die kind of prematurely. He left 4 kids under the age of 13. And given the time frame of all of this, my grandma Caroline did not actually inherit the legal rights to her children. I know that sounds crazy, but the children had to have a male guardian that was registered with the courts. The same thing goes for the real estate assets. So one of my great aunt's husbands, Mr. Fitch, he actually ended up being the conservator for the children, and he actually ended up being the conservator for the real estate. And I have a couple letters between my grandma Caroline and her other daughter, my Aunt Ida, and Grandma Caroline talks about how Uncle Fitch was able to at last convince the tenant to move out of the duplex after not having paid us a full month of rent for 3 months. So it's kind of interesting to read some of these letters and see, oh, they had issues too with tenants paying rent. And I'm not quite, it doesn't seem like it was a legal proceeding, an eviction or anything. And part of me is kind of curious, like, did evictions exist back then? What did they look like? Or was this something where, did you just change the locks on the person? Like, I don't know, maybe Uncle Fitch just changed the locks and that was the end of the story for my grandma Caroline's tenants. Like, I don't know for sure what this meant. But it's really interesting to kind of see the little pieces of real estate that are discussed in some of the letters. There's a letter in front of me from 1875, and it's from Caroline, again, to her daughter, Ida. And she says, "I'm so glad that your brother was able to square away the rental unit in the city. I was getting really concerned with the water situation in that unit." It sounds like they had some sort of basement flooding. "I can't believe he was able to get somebody to fix the issue. And I'm really, really grateful that it did not cost as much money as your brother thought it might." And then it says in parentheses, "Your brother thought it was going to cost about $23 to fix." Now, $23 back then, that's a lot of money. So she was really glad it didn't actually cost the full $23 to fix whatever was going on in the basement of that property. But anyway, so that's going to wrap up this conversation about my generational real estate investing, some of the lessons that I've learned from my parents and my grandparents. I hope you guys enjoyed this, because I really wasn't sure, again, about recording this one, because I try not to make this podcast about me. But I do have to admit there is a uniqueness in my story in knowing about different avenues of real estate investing, firsthand experience, and how real estate has changed over the years. There's actually a presentation that I used to give, obviously pre-COVID, but back in like 2017, 2018, one of the first traveling speaking engagements I did was actually about the changes of real estate that have occurred in the past 70 years. And a lot of people are just amazed to think that real estate investing existed before like the 1930s, because again, we don't really think about that. But then just seeing how much it has changed since my grandfather invested to what I am doing right now, there's a lot of change. And I definitely do not, I don't lose track of the fact of how much I have in regards to knowledge and being able to see kind of the full spectrum of where it started and where it ended up. And I really do appreciate having that opportunity in my life. All right, that wraps up this week's podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really hope you did. I put a lot of heart and my soul into this because I'm talking about my family and generations of real estate investing. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next time.